Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 470 for the 14th of Adar in a regular year. Today is Purim, so happy Purim, everybody. Purim is my favorite holiday. Purim is a very holy and special day. It's one of the big themes of Purim is about how God really permeates every single aspect of our lives. In the story of Purim, in Megillas Esther, we really see this. We really see how what's interesting about the book is that the Sefer does not contain the name of God. And the explanation for that is not that God isn't present in the story of Purim, but rather God is so much present, so very present and in such an essential way that to boil down God's presence into any one of the names of God would not give it justice to the presence of God. So it's really more about the permeability of God in our everyday lives, in everything, how everything is really divine providence, whether it's overtly so or not so overtly so, it's always there. And the other aspect of Purim is that this is the holiday in which the Jews really accepted the Torah willingly. So we know that at Mount Sinai, we accepted the Torah, but was sort of in a coerced way. Like there are stories in the oral law about how it is that how it's explained that that God actually held the mountain over the Jews, the heads of the Jews, and kind of said, accept the Torah or else I'll drop this mountain over your head. There's explanations for that, why that was, what that really means, and things like that. Now's not the time to get into it, but Purim was the time when we willingly accepted the Torah. We really came to fully embrace the Torah. And as we'll see today, when we get into today's episode, we're actually going to be talking about the Torah specifically and the receiving of the Torah and what this original experience was like for us, and how it was almost an experience in which we actually did almost expire, because it was a very intense spiritual experience. And we're going to talk about how it is that we survived that experience, and just about how it is that we balance this idea of God permeating our everyday life with living and not getting overwhelmed by this experience. So today we'll be beginning a new chapter 34 of Likkutei Amarim. And up until now, a lot of what we've been focusing on is this idea of kind of like getting out of our physical limitations and kind of trying to break through the coarseness of our bodies and the coarseness of our physical eyes, and understanding that what we see and what we experience in our physical bodies is not the full picture. There's more than meets the eye. So we've been on a long journey so far. We talked about not falling into the tourist trap. We talked about not taking our own bodies and physical sensations and emotions too seriously. We talked about not thinking too highly of ourselves. We talked about not seeing the differences between people and between our brethren, our fellow Jews, as being the main thing, and trying to go deeper and seeing beyond that. And last time we really took it to the next level, where we talked about really trying to tap into the ultimate reality with our perception and focus and meditation on thinking about how God is the ultimate reality. So if you really take these teachings seriously, which I'm hoping you do, this is the idea of the book, is to really think about these things and try to integrate them into your life, you might experience a certain kind of detachment or disorientation in terms of understanding your life and understanding who you are. So like when you start thinking that, okay, my physical body is not something I should really take too seriously. My emotions are not something I should really focus on. Everything is really godliness and there is no true reality but God. It's like, where does this leave me? Where am I? And this can kind of lead to a certain spaciness almost. And this is something that if you think about maybe an association that a lot of people might have with very spiritual or very religious kind of people, is that they are not so grounded, they're not so practical, they're kind of detached from reality and everything. And we know that Judaism is not this type of religion. We're not really meant to be ascetics. We're not meant to just totally be living in this like blissed out state of non-attachment and those kind of things. That's more of like an Indian kind of Eastern way of thinking of things. So how do we circumvent this? How do we prevent this kind of thing from happening? So that's what today's episode is really going to be about. And what we're going to be learning about today, and we'll get into the text in just a minute, is first of all acknowledging the reality of this phenomenon and how this isn't the first time that you if a person might experience this sense of like being ungrounded and this sense of just losing themselves in God and in spirituality and all that stuff. This is actually the first time we experienced this was a long time ago when we received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and we actually were not able to handle it then, and we actually literally died for a minute, and we had to be revived and brought back to earth. And this understanding can really bring us a new appreciation of our forefathers and of our teacher Moshe Rabbeinu and these kind of holy men who lived on this level of self-nullification, but yet somehow they were on such a high level and had such a strong attachment to God that they were able to somehow balance this embodiment of godliness so that they didn't just like fly away, and they were actually able to function. But for most of us, we're not able to do that. And so this is a true reality that God acknowledged. And the remedy for this is that he gave us instructions to build him a physical dwelling place in order to contain his presence, because he knew that without this, we really wouldn't be able to handle it. And so this physical container, so to speak, that God instructed us to build for him is what is called the sanctuary. Later on, this evolved into the temple. What we know of the temple, there was a first temple and the second temple, but originally the original temple, so to speak, was otherwise known as the sanctuary, the Mishkan in the desert. And then nowadays, now that we no longer have neither a Mishkan nor a temple, we don't have any of these things. So what now? What is the containment for our experience of godliness, for our service of God now? So as we'll come to see, the containment for that is Halacha, is the laws of the Torah. So that might sound kind of like anticlimactic to you, but we'll come to see that it actually makes a lot of sense. And an analogy that I thought of to kind of explain this is the idea of trail markers in the forest when you're hiking. So for those of you who have ever been hiking, then you'll notice that there are little markers that are on trees to keep you on the path of the hiking. So let's say, sometimes there'll be different types of markers depending on the trail that you're taking. There might be multiple trails in the forest, and you want to make sure that you're staying on your path. So there might be like a white mark on a tree and then a red mark on another tree. And so if you're on the white path, you follow the white markers. If you're on the red path, you follow the red markers. And this prevents you from getting lost. So this is really a very useful tool for the average person who's hiking in the forest. Now, really seasoned hikers, really people who are like experts in forestry and things like that, they might not need to see the demarcations, but it doesn't mean that they're not keeping to the demarcations. It's just that they're more familiar with the forest itself, and they can notice things that we won't necessarily notice. So this is sort of the idea of when we think about the evolution from the forefathers and the prophets to the receiving of the Torah, to the building of the Mishkan, to our days nowadays when we have the actual written down halacha. So back in the day, it's not that the forefathers and the prophets didn't keep halacha and that they were so holy that they didn't need halacha. They very much did keep halacha, but they were more like the expert foresters who didn't need these like demarcations in the same way because they were just more sensitive. They were more knowledgeable. They were closer to what was going on. Versus for us, we're more like the, regular hiker who's just like an average hiker, doesn't really know much about forestry or hiking or anything like that. Even somebody who's been hiking for a very long time nowadays, they're not necessarily on that same level as being an expert. They still need those demarcations, which is why nowadays halacha does really serve as that containment that we need to keep us on that path of connecting with God while still keeping ourself in the process by having it be that we are the ones that are serving God. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. And as mentioned, we're going to be beginning a new chapter today, chapter 34 of Likkutei Amarim. So the Alter Rebbe says that here it is known that the forefathers, they are the chariot. So remember, we learned about this in previous episodes that we called the forefathers were called chariots of God because literally their whole entire body served to express God's will at every single moment. And they never did anything in either thought, speech, or action that ever opposed God's will in any way. So that's what the Alter Rebbe says here. He says that their entire lives, they never stopped, even for a moment, to connect their attention and their souls to the to the master of the universe with this type of nullification that we talked about in the previous chapter about this idea of the unity of God and how everything is really united within God. And after the forefathers, then there were all the prophets, all the Nevi'im, each one according to the level of their soul. They also had this level of attachment to God in this way, and according to their understanding and according to their level. And then we see that there was Moshe Rabbeinu, who Moses, our forefather, he was the highest of all the prophets. And it was said about Moshe Rabbeinu that he was so high that it said Shechina medaberet mitoch hagorono, that the Shechina, the divine indwelling, spoke from his mouth, from the mouth of Moshe. So it's from the throat of Moshe. So it was like whenever Moshe Rabbeinu would speak, his speech was literally, it was just an expression of the divine indwelling. So it was that level of connectedness that Moshe had. And we all actually had a taste of this, explains the Alter Rebbe, when we stood at Har Sinai. So when all the Jews stood at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, we had a split second of this moment of complete and utter connection with God. The only thing is we weren't able to handle it because, as is explained in the Gemara, and you can look this up in Masechet Shabbos, page 88b, that with every single utterance that came out of Mount Sinai, the souls of the Jews just flew up and flew out of their bodies. So it's like they literally couldn't handle this expression, this manifestation and revelation of God. And this is the idea of just totally being nullified in one source, like how we described if you were to shine like a ray of sunlight into the sun kind of thing. So this is why now we can understand why it is that what happened as soon as we received the Torah, and you can actually see this if you've been following along with the Torah portions lately. This was actually the evolution of how it's brought down in the Torah, is we received the Torah, and then immediately after that, what did God tell us to do? He said that we should make a sanctuary for him. And in the sanctuary, there should be the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies, that would be the place for God to have his Shechina, have his indwelling, dwell within it. And this Shechina is the revelation of God's unity, of God's oneness, as will be explained further on. So the Alter Rebbe is hinting at the fact that we're going to talk about this later on more in depth in Tanya. That's coming up in chapter 53. Again, now we're in chapter 34. So that's the end of this section. And so just kind of to sum it up, is what we've learned today is this idea that, as we've learned about previously, our forefathers were really unique in the sense that they served as real chariots for God, that their entire bodies, every single moment of their lives, totally and utterly reflected God and were focused on God and fulfilling his will. And then the Alter Rebbe taught us that this was also true with the prophets, and most especially with Moshe Rabbeinu, who was like at the highest level of all the prophets, and that all of us as Jews experienced this level of unification, this level of nullification in God at the time that we received the Torah. But it was so much, and it was such an intense experience that we literally were not able to handle it, which is why right after that, God instructed us to build the sanctuary for him. Because in building the sanctuary, it was kind of like this realization that this indwelling of God in the world, the Shechina, was really too much for us, too intense for us to handle on our own. So it was sort of to serve as like a container of sorts in order for us not to disappear. Now, since the temple was destroyed, that God no longer has in his world a sanctuary, an abode to dwell within in order to reveal his unity. So there's no place in the world since the temple has been destroyed and we no longer have a sanctuary, God can no longer be revealed in his true unified way in the world if not for, so there is a place that he can be revealed, how is it that he becomes revealed nowadays? Within the 4 cubits of Halacha, of Jewish law. Why? Because what is Jewish law? Jewish law is the will of God and his wisdom, which are revealed within the various laws that are set out before us. So thus, the Alter Rebbe explains to us, after a person sits and meditates in their mind about this whole idea of nullification of the self and how everything is truly nullified in God, which is something we learned about in the previous chapter. Go back, please, and listen to those episodes if you haven't already. Then the next step in this meditation is that a person should really ingrain it in their heart to understand the fact that because we are lowly of minds, like we have a very limited mind, and because I am lowly of minds, like my mind is very limited, and the root of my soul is very limited, that the smallness of my mind and the limitation of my soul inhibit me from being this true chariot and sanctuary for the unity of God in a true way, because of the fact, as we learned, that there is no thought that can contain him. So there is no way that I can actually contain God within my thoughts. And not even in the smallest measure to the extent of what our forefathers and our prophets understood God. So it's like we sort of have to humble ourselves and realize the limitation of our intellect and of our soul, that we are nowhere near the level of our forefathers and our prophets who were able to contain God within them. Then thus we say to ourselves, so I will say that, okay, this is true. I have this very limited mind and very limited capacity in my soul. So I'm going to make a sanctuary for God. And how am I going to do this? I'm going to do this through studying his Torah. Every time that I have free time, in my spare time, I'm going to devote it to studying Torah anytime I can, whether it's during the daytime, whether it's at night, as stipulated by the laws that govern the learning of Torah. So it's actually a Torah law to study Torah. So in this studying of Torah, this is a good opportunity to learn about God's laws. And the Alter Rebbe here brings a citation from the Gemara from Menachos, page 99b, that says that even if a person learns one chapter in the morning and one at night, that is enough to fulfill it's like sort of like the minimum quota for fulfilling this law of learning Torah that we're supposed to do. And so when a person does this, when a person devotes their spare time to learning about God and learning about his Torah, then through this, we should actually be really happy, and we should feel a gladness in our heart and rejoice and give thanks for our inheritance with great joy and with gladness on the heart over the fact that we merited in order to be a guest for God's glory, for God's greatness, twice a day, according to what we're able to, according to the amount of the spare time that we have and that we're able to allot to them, and according to the capacity which God gave to each individual person to do this. So this is the end of the section. So just to kind of bring it all together again and kind of maybe bring it back to this forest analogy to see if hopefully all of that can make sense, is what the Alter Rebbe is basically really teaching us today is that without studying Torah and without specifically learning about the laws of the Torah, we're kind of lost. We're not the forefathers. We are not Moshe Rabbeinu. We're not the prophets, and we shouldn't mistakenly think that we are, and that we are able to connect with God in a way that is like over and above reason or through our own intellect or anything like that, because we've already learned this idea that there is no thought, there is no intellect that is able to contain God. So just like if a person is in the forest, there's absolutely no way, especially if they're just going to be this like average person, that a person can find their way out of the forest just by kind of like looking around and figuring things out. Like there's a really small chance that the person's going to figure out their way out of the forest. So in order to really contain God in a true way, and in order to live with a godly awareness without getting lost, it's really, really essential and incumbent upon each individual to take seriously the dictate, which is to study Torah, and specifically to study the laws of the Torah, which are the manifestation of God's will. So we can really think about these laws and the halachos that Hashem laid out for us as sort of like being like the markers that you see in the forest that keep you in check and keep you knowing in which direction you're going, and sort of contain your hike in a way that you can really enjoy the hike without getting lost. That's sort of how I understand it to be. Again, no analogy is really perfect, and it's just an analogy that I kind of came up with to explain these concepts better. I hope it helped. And that is the basic idea. And we're going to continue with this tomorrow, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.